Good morning, everybody. My name is Hans-Rudolf Heinemann, and I'm the moderator of this morning. Let me just introduce very briefly. My background is in engineering. I did a lot of work in natural hazards management, and after some time I gave also involved in interdisciplinary research, mainly on risk behavior. And I'm at ETH Zurich and also at the Collegium Helveticum, where I've been involved in those issues. Now, if I have a look on this morning, we will have three contributions. And yesterday, if you remember, there was some debate about rationality assumptions in the whole political process, and I was asking myself if this would be somewhat a framework that is guiding ourselves through this morning. May I just briefly come up with what are the assumptions of rationality? The first assumption is you have always full information. You know everything what is required out there. This is one basic assumption. Second, the preferences you have are consistent in space and time. You don't change your mind. This is something important. And number three is you can always measure the preference on some scale. And this is consistent. And if I just sum up those assumptions, it's very clear that those don't hold. First of all, if it comes to decision-making in a policy framework. Now, what we will see this morning, three contributions. The first one from Professor Lupia. He is addressing the issue how to improve the citizens' competence, how to improve knowledge of the citizens to get at least a little bit better in this assumption that you have enough information, at least, not full information. Then the second contribution from Van Dele is about values, and it has to do with how values change and how those are influenced. And then we have a third contribution. It's about volatility of public opinion. So it's about the second assumption of rationality, the consistency of preferences in space and time, and how this is going to change. Let me now just introduce briefly Professor Lupia. Originally, he spent some of his career at the United States, at the West Coast, if I understand correctly. So he did an MS and his PhD at Caltech in California. And then he went downwards to San Diego, where he was an assistant, an associate, and finally a professor of political sciences. And then I learned just from him, people were asking, why are you moving north? Because it's so nice in San Diego. He moved to Michigan, and there is a reason for that, because I think it's one of the finest places to do social research in the world, with a lot of interesting scholars who really did a lot in terms of really path-breaking research. His interests are in topics like policy, including voting, elections, persuasion, opinion change, civic education, coalition governance, and so on. He will give us a talk this morning, The Trouble with Voters and Those Who Try to Fit Them, Information and Competence in Modern Politics. Please, Professor Lupia, the floor is yours.
Thank you and good morning. I'd like to thank the organizers for having me out here to a beautiful place where so far I've been able to meet a lot of very interesting people, including a lot of young scholars. What I want to talk about today is you and me. A lot of people are motivated by a desire to improve the capacity of democracy, or to make sure that policy making about complex matters is more informed. And so we have great intentions, but how well do we do in pursuing those intentions? And so what I want to suggest is that in the title, The Trouble with Voters, the trouble with voters is going to be that there are some things that they don't know. Actually, there's a lot. But what I'm going to talk about mostly today is the problem with us, the people who try to fix voters. And instead of just talking about the problems with us, I want to try to talk about how some lessons from the social sciences can help us do a little bit better. So the trouble with voters is they don't seem to know very much. Anytime we ask them questions about politics or policy, we're often disappointed in what we see. A lot of people can't answer what seem to be even basic questions correctly, and a lot of other people just simply say they don't know. People think this is a problem because they're concerned that a lack of knowledge by voters leads them to make very different decisions than they would have made had they known more. That they could vote against their own interests or maybe the interests of their nation. So that's the trouble with voters. The evidence we have for this comes from questions. These are basic survey questions. So most of the questions that are on an electron survey, you can't get wrong because they're subjective. They're about your opinions or your feelings or your perceptions. But sometimes on political surveys, people will put fact-based questions on there. These are fact-based questions in the US about some basic aspects of government, and these do have right and wrong answers. And if you put questions like this on a survey, it's very common for at least half of the voters to get these questions wrong, sometimes much more so. And so the concern is that if people can't answer questions like these, then how do they vote? So people see data on what voters don't know, and they become very concerned. And let they be us for a moment. So we become very concerned about the public. And so we come up with a plan to improve the capacity of democracy by improving citizen competence, by improving citizens' abilities to understand various things about policy. Now, the way that we'd have to do that is through persuasion. So at time one, we encounter a voter who lacks knowledge about a policy, and our goal is to increase their knowledge by some time too, by some later time. So we want to increase them. We'd have to do that by persuasion. And what I mean by persuasion is getting people to change their minds. They don't have to change what they want necessarily, but they have to change maybe what they know, what facts they bring to bear, what memories they have when they think about politics. Persuasion is the term I'm using for how we get there. It's any change in mind. It could even be, I even count as persuasion a reinforcement of beliefs. If I knew that I wanted a red car beforehand and you tell me something that makes me want it even more, that constitutes a change in mind. And that would be an example of persuasion as well. So the typical theory of a plan to persuade people as a means of improving their competence is that if we tell them what we know, they'll change what they do. And after all, why shouldn't they listen to us? Because we're experts, right? We have knowledge of science or of the social sciences or of human nature, right? And we've studied at the universities and had so many experiences that if we simply tell people what we know, why wouldn't they listen? So this is a plan that we see undertaken over and over again. And there's nothing wrong with this plan except for the fact that it hardly ever works. For most voter education campaigns, failure is the norm. People don't pay attention to what you're saying, or if they pay attention to it, they don't remember. Or even if they remember some small element of the presentation you've made, when it comes time to act, they forget about it as if they've never heard about it. And the consequence of that, I would say, is tragic. And the reason that I say it's tragic is because the problem isn't them, the problem is us. Okay? We, the experts, tend to work from very simple folk theories about how people learn, about what they remember, about why they would listen to us as opposed to watching a football match or reading about celebrities. Right? We often work from theories thinking, since we're experts at our subject matter, by merely saying things, others will follow. And of course, those of us who are old enough have experienced that not occurring. But as a general matter, many civic education strategies are based on the premise, since we're experts, simply telling people what we know is sufficient. And as I'll walk through now, that's not a good strategy. Okay? So what's the problem with us? Okay? Well, the problem with us is we're experts and we hang around with other experts. And sometimes we develop technical languages, jargon if you will, that help us understand and explain very complex things. And so we come to believe that if I stand in front of you, there's a certain set of things I have to know because I'm an expert. A certain set of concepts and definitions that I wouldn't be caught dead not knowing. What can happen, though, is then we sometimes think that, well, other people should know these things too, right? Because this will help them be better voters. But this is where the problems come in. Are the things that we need to know in our careers the same types of things that voters need to know to vote, or to do the other things that democracy requires of citizens? We often assume that they're the same, but typically they're not. Another problem we have is a view of them. Particularly after they don't listen to us. We say, well, they're not listening or paying attention because they're stupid or because they're lazy and they have bad tastes, right? We think the problem is them, all right? But the point I want to emphasize is the problem really isn't them, okay? So the trouble, I call people like us fixers. We're trying to fix voters. But we have some problems of our own that we have to deal with first if we ever want to succeed in informing voters. So one of the troubles with us is we lack important information about how learning really occurs in the human mind. We have folk theories that date back centuries that, sound great, but aren't actually consistent with any empirical evidence from 20th century social science. As a result, we often have a tendency to misdiagnose voter competence or incompetence. Sometimes we'll say that someone is incompetent, unable to cast a particular vote, because they don't know something we know. That's a bit like saying, suppose there's one road to the airport in Zurich, and there's one route and we know how to get there. I could ask you, if you don't know that route, can you get to the airport? Well, it all depends on whether there's a second route available. Now, if you don't know my route, but you know the other route, you're competent at getting there. But many times in the guise of voter competence, we say, well, if you don't know my route, then obviously you can't get to the airport. Right? That doesn't make any sense, and yet in the context of civic competence, it's something that we, the experts, do all the time. Finally, as a result of lacking information about how people learn, we often design ineffective or inefficient ways to try and inform voters. We make assumptions about what they should believe or what they should want, and then base our strategy on that. I'm going to give some examples of how this works, but if you're tired or you lack attention or you want a 30-second version of the talk, here it is. Suppose that you and a friend of yours are walking through the woods, and your friend gets lost, and you want to get them out of the woods. Suppose, moreover, that you're an expert on the woods, that you've been in the woods since your childhood and you know everything about it. The question is, can you lead your friend out of the woods? Can you lead them from being lost to being back with you where you want them to be? Okay? Well, certainly knowing about the woods is an important part of being able to lead them out. But there's something else you have to know, and that's where your friend is and what they can do. Because if you don't know where your friend is, you're saying, take 3 steps to the left, and they're walking right into a tree, right? Because you've made an assumption about where they are, but really they're starting from a different place. Or you're saying, take 3 steps to the right, and it happens that there's a huge log there, and your friend can't get over that log, right? To get your friend out of the woods, you not only have to know the woods, you have to know about your friend, where they're starting out from, and what they can do. The same is true with experts when we're trying to talk to voters. We have to understand where they are, right? Where they're starting out and what they can do. If we understand those things, we have a better chance of persuading them to think about, complex topics in policy. But if we assume that they're at a certain place in the woods and they're wrong, they're going to be in the woods for a long time. Okay? So can we fix ourselves? And the answer I'm going to give today is there's some very simple ideas from across the social sciences that we can apply to make our own endeavors more effective. So what's going to happen here is biology will define the possibilities. I won't go into details or get into jargon today, but I'd be happy to answer questions. There are certain elements of brain structure that help us understand learning, that help us differentiate things about learning that just can't possibly be true from things about learning from which we can build effective strategies. Building from that, there are social scientific studies of persuasion, principally from the field of psychology, but there are also relevant studies in fields like economics, sociology, and political science that help us understand the requirements for getting someone to rethink an issue in a way that would improve their competence, improve their ability to cast the same vote they would have cast had they known more, for example. So that's where we're going to go today. But let me start with an example of what I'm talking about, and that is a binary choice. What I mean by that is a choice where a voter has two alternatives. Maybe it's like a referendum, and the voter gets to vote yes or no. And so, I lived in California for a while, that was mentioned, and referendums are used very often there, as in some countries in Europe. And many people question whether we should let the voters decide on all these things. After all, the issues are very complex that voters are faced with. But one thing that's true about referenda is that by the time it gets to the voters, you might argue the issue isn't very complex, because the voter only has two choices, yes or no. How hard is it to make a competent choice when there are only two alternatives? Right? For advice on that, I want to ask an expert. Okay, so these are questions we might ask, and maybe people don't know the answers. Can people who don't know answers to these questions be competent when casting a binary choice? So let me be clear about what I mean by competence, okay? If we're going to talk about voter competence, it has to be with respect to a task. Many times people talk about competence and they're unclear or vague about competence with respect to what. But you have to be competent at something, okay? So when I talk about competence, I mean with respect to a task. So in a binary choice, what competence is would be choosing the best one of the two alternatives. Suppose for a particular question, yes is the best answer for you or for your society, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Suppose one answer is best. Then you're choosing the best one out of two alternatives. That's a little easier than being competent when you're trying to write a constitution. A constitution, at the end of the day, is a combination of words. You put thousands, maybe tens of thousands of words in a document, and they become a constitution. There are billions, let's say, an almost infinite number of ways to combine these words, but only a small number of these combinations make a viable constitution. To choose one of these viable alternatives from a very large set is a lot harder. So competence for writing a constitution is much harder for a binary choice. But for voters, most of the time we ask them to make very small choices, okay? So I want to say that a voter is competent if she makes the same decision she would have made given different or more information. Now you might ask the question, well, how much information is enough? And it turns out that's an interesting question, all right? What I want to leave I'm happy to take that in the Q&A. There are some philosophical debates underlying sort of, this gets close to what is truth, okay? But for right now, for the purposes, you can decide for yourself what the optimal amount of information for someone to know is. And then what I want to ask is, if someone knew that, could we help them make the same choice they would have made if they had the information you want them to have? Okay? So now let's think about this binary choice example. That's a chimp. And so the question I want to ask you is, if you're a voter, are you more competent than a chimp? Okay? And so what do we know about chimps? Well, one thing we know about chimp is a chimp can hold a coin. And a chimp can throw a coin into the air, right? And the coin can land on one side or the other, heads or tails, okay? A chimp with a coin, right? If there's a binary choice and there's two options, a chimp with a coin can get the right answer half the time. Suppose there's a right answer to a question and the chimp uses a coin to try and get the answer. The chimp gets the answer right half the time. Is a voter dumber than a chimp with a coin? But let's think about that more generally in terms of democracy. Let's just say for a second that the chimp, instead of having a coin that landed on the right answer 50% of the time, had a coin that landed on the right answer 51% of the time. And let's say instead of one chimp, we now had many chimps. The number of chimps that, are the same as the population of a city or a canton or a nation. And what we decided to do was allow majority rule of the chimps to decide on a yes or no question, okay? So if there was just one chimp flipping a coin, the chimp would get the right answer 51% of the time. If there were 305 chimps flipping coins and we looked at what a majority of the coins said, the majority would get the right answer 61% of the time. And if there were 1 million or 10 million chimps flipping coins, a majority of chimps would get the right answer almost 100% of the time. This is the nature of binary choice, right? This is just statistics. It's the probability of a majority getting a particular answer, given that each one of them get the answer 51% of the time. So now, in terms of thinking about competence, is a voter less competent than a chimp with a coin? Because that's really, in terms of binary choice, the relevant comparison. So that's a question to think about. But what I want to focus on now is, suppose we run into cases where voters are easily manipulated or lack information. Could we improve their capabilities to make them at least close to the competence of a chimp, or if you have greater ambitions, to be more competent? So what would it take to improve voter competence? And the key thing is that persuasion is necessary. That is, if I'm incompetent at time 1, I must change my mind about something to be competent at time 2. So I'll focus now on necessary conditions for persuasion. What are the things we need to know? What are the things we need to do to change the mind of another? I'm going to focus on 3 necessary conditions, and by necessary I mean you have to accomplish these things. You have to win these battles to persuade someone. If you win the battles, you don't necessarily win. These are only necessary conditions. They're not necessary and sufficient. So if you lose any of these battles, I know that you won't be persuasive. If you win all 3, I know that you can be persuasive. Many civic education campaigns are designed in a way that I know in advance that they won't win one or more of these battles, which is why their failure can be anticipated. But by having a civic education group pay attention to these things, I can at least give them a chance to succeed. So now I'll work through these in order. The first is attention, okay? The key thing to know about attention is that it's scarce, is that it's narrow, it's that it's precious, but principally scarce, okay? So the physical manifestation of attention, some scientists call working memory or short-term memory. Short-term memory is the set of things that you can attend to that you're mentally conscious of at any moment. People have tried to estimate the capacity of working memory. And the most famous estimate is by Baddeley, who says it's 7 plus or minus 2 chunks. Chunks is the technical term. A chunk is something that you think about, like a wall or a shoe or the relationship between X and Y. Right? Expert chunks have more information than novice chunks, but still for any of us, the number of things we can pay attention to at any particular time is 7 plus or minus 2. One of the reasons this matters for persuasion is that sometimes when we make presentations like the one I'm making now, we can engage in a fiction. The fiction is that the audience will hang on my every word, will remember everything I'm saying verbatim. But that's not the case. The capacity of working memory doesn't allow it. Because right now, as I'm speaking to you, I am competing for one of those 7 chunks in your working memory with all kinds of other things. Let me alert you to some of the things that I'm competing with. Lights, right? The paintings on the wall. I'm competing with those. If you're paying attention to those, right, and I'm not helping myself right now, you're not paying attention to me. But it's worse than that. It's worse than that. Because in addition to things that are in the room right now, also competing for attention are things that happened before you walked into the room, like what you had for breakfast. If you're thinking about that, you're having a harder time paying attention to me, right? But it's worse than that because you can also think about the future, okay? So if you're thinking about, how you're going to get back to Zurich, now it's harder to pay attention to me. But it's worse than that because in a sense, you can be your own worst enemy. And it's not just by pointing to people all the distractions. It's the fact that, in terms of your memory, what I'm saying right now is competing with what I'm saying right now and what I'm saying right now. They're all competing. And so if you're paying attention to what I'm saying right now, it's harder to remember what I said just a couple seconds ago. And this is true for all of us. And so if we have this idea that people are hanging on our every word, the capacity of working memory doesn't allow that. If somebody's going to really focus on something you've said, they're not going to hear the next couple things you say. They're not going to pay attention. And no matter how expert you are, or how persuasive you might think you are, you can't change this. Biology defines it. But it's worse than that. Because working memory also has a very high decay rate. If something I say is fortunate enough to earn a place in your working memory, this competition for your memory, for working memory, still goes on. And so the fact is, most of the things that we pay attention to, we stop paying attention to within milliseconds. It's as if we never thought about it. So you can take a fleeting glance and notice something about a wall, right, or something about my suit, but a couple seconds later, you're on to something else, okay? Again, these are not things that you can change. They are true about your audience. So, how do you win this battle for attention, okay? Well, to win, I'm going to introduce a term, the carrying utterance. So an utterance is a way that I convey information. Right now I'm uttering statements. I'm making propositions and things of that nature. To win the battle for attention against all of the other competitors, what I'm saying has to imply a large change. Sorry, that's meant to be, it must imply a large change in pleasure or pain, urgency, right? If a train is coming near you, you pay attention to it. If a lion is chasing you, you pay attention to it. If you have an exam and you're pretty certain a question's going to be on there, you pay attention to it, right? And it has to prevail over proximate others. So if I say something very important right now, the chances that you'll listen to what I'm saying right after that are minimized. So for the carrying utterance to get into your working memory, it has to prevail. Let me point out one other thing about attention, because if you're an expert, your self-esteem can depend on you thinking, I'm very good at persuading. I just want to tell you one more bad story and then I'll move on. Something that all of us are very good at is pretending that we're paying attention. So right now I'm looking at all of you and I stop at certain points and you nod, right? And that's something we do. But nodding is a way to sort of signal that you're paying attention, but it doesn't actually mean you're paying attention. And one of the nice things now, I promised I wouldn't leave the stage, so I'm going to stay up here, but you can get a window. Right now, technology gives us a window to what people are actually paying attention to. And so what I'd ask you to do is look around the room and see if there's anyone, and I don't mean to embarrass you, but if there's anyone with an electronic device right now. Okay? Because if you have an electronic device, you could be doing a couple things with it. One is you could be documenting everything I'm saying because you're paying attention. But there are other things you can do with electronic devices, like check your email, or look at websites that have nothing to do with this talk. And some people think, oh, that's very rude to do, and yet it happens all the time. What I want to say about that is that behavior is not news to people who know this, because all that electronic window is telling you is what people are doing when they don't have the screen in front of them, right? People who are looking at me right now, some of them are thinking about their laundry. Right? And so, even if you think people are paying attention to you, you can't get away from biology. They're probably not paying attention. And so for you to win the battle for attention, you have to convey your ideas in certain ways. Okay? urgency and relevance are key. So now let's start to think about, suppose you have said something that is in working memory. What happens next? So I have you paying attention to what I've said, okay? So what will you remember? Lots of people imagine that once you think about it, you'll remember it forever. But I want you to think about the most important events in your life, for example, and I'm going to ask you, how much do you remember about them? Your wedding, the birth of a child, a graduation? If you try as hard as you can, probably you can only conjure up a minute of memories or less about the most important things in your life. Why would you then expect that a book that you write or a speech that you give is going to be remembered in its entirety? In fact, what people will remember is only 2 or 3 key moments of the lecture that you give, right? You can't change this, but what you can do is design your lecture or your civic education program with that truth in mind, trying to create a couple moments that people will remember, because that's all they're going to remember anyways, and it's not your fault. So what will you remember? If you don't think about memory in this way, chances are what an audience remembers about your presentation will be very different than what you want them to remember. And again, this is a common error in civic education campaigns. People think, look, we'll present the facts that are most important to us. We'll even put them on shiny paper with pictures. And the question you have to ask yourself is, would someone pay attention to this? And if they did, would they remember it? As opposed to all the other things they could be looking at that moment. The next step in the process of persuasion is elaboration. Elaboration is a term that psychologists use just as a substitute for the idea of thinking about it. Elaboration means thinking about it. From a biological point of view, thinking about something is a bit like exercise. It's a bit like working out. You know, when you work out and you run, your muscles get bigger and they react faster. In your brain, when you think about something, there are things called dendrites. Okay, and they are the conduct of electrical activity. And what happens with memory is that if the electrical activity from one dendrite reaches another, that's the basis of an association. The thinking that something is like something else. Okay, that's the basis of memory. When you learn, you're strengthening a particular muscle. You're strengthening a particular dendrite, right? Reducing the gap between that dendrite and another. When you reduce the gap, it makes memory of that association more likely. That's the physical basis of learning. That's the physical basis of memory, but it doesn't happen at random. What you need to know about elaboration is that if we pay attention to something, all that you have gained is the opportunity to make a longer lasting memory. But paying attention to something and remembering it is not the same, okay? So one of the scientific terms is I'm trying to change an activation potential. That if I see dog, I think about bark, right? The higher that association is, the higher is the activation potential. What learning involves is trying to increase the activation potential of one memory with respect to another. So if the idea you wanted to convince people that climate change was a result of human action, you're trying to increase the association of human action when someone thinks about climate change, or vice versa. Okay. The ultimate product of thinking about something is that a representation of an idea can go to long-term memory. So going from working memory to long-term memory requires elaboration, thinking about it. But thinking requires effort. Thinking requires paying attention and thinking for long enough about how two concepts might connect. That doesn't happen automatically. Perceptions of urgency and efficacy, right? Urgency, I need to do this. Efficacy, if I think about this, something good will happen, or I can prevent something bad from happening. They're the fuel you need to form new memories. Without that fuel, you could be paying attention, but not thinking, okay? To persuade, elaboration must occur. The chunks that get into working memory leave a longer lasting memory then, only if the chunk is perceived by the person as unique and highly relevant. Now here's the key. The relevance of the information is not from the expert's perspective. It doesn't matter here if the speaker thinks the information is relevant. It is all about the person who's lost in the woods. It's all about the voter. Do they think it's relevant? Now you might say, well, this is easy. But I could show you thousands of examples, literally, where an expert community made a mistaken assumption about what voters would think was relevant, because they just thought what we think is relevant is what we'll point out. But I'm going to show you two. All right? One of the things I get to do, I talk to climate scientists quite a bit. I'm brought in front of groups of climate scientists throughout the US, and I give various lectures where the first 5 minutes is, the problem is you, and then the rest of it is, here's how you can convey things about climate science to policy and public audiences more effectively. Here's the trouble you have if you're trying to talk about climate to a bigger audience. To most citizens, the benefits of doing something like reducing emissions is distant, abstract, and uncertain. So I know a lot of you are interested in climate here. If you reduce emissions, what exactly is going to happen? Right? The state of climate science today is we're a lot better at explaining what happened in the past than we are at knowing what would happen in the future. Even the best climate models have a lot of uncertainty about what would happen if we cut emissions by 20, 50% today. We're uncertain, and to most people, those benefits are distant. Will it affect my life? You know, if you ask an average voter, how will reducing emissions affect my life? You know, I mean, it might stop a glacier from melting, but I don't understand how that affects my community, right? So for many people, they're distant. And the problem is, the benefits of lifestyle change that we're asking people to do, they're immediate. You know, drive a hybrid, you know, take your bike, don't use as many light bulbs. They're concrete and they're certain. So in a way, it's like there's a story, there's a story, Jack and the Beanstalk, where a guy, Jack, trades his cow for magic beans in the hope that the magic beans will create a stalk that goes to a castle. In a way, you're asking people to give up their livelihood, the cow, for what, from their perspective, looks like magic beans. So how do we solve this problem? Okay, I'm going to talk to you about that in a second, but let me just show you some images, and we can decide whether they're helpful. In climate change, this is a common image that's put out there, right? There's this polar bear, lonely polar bear on an iceberg. And so many experts think that this will help voters realize how important climate change is. But most voters aren't polar bears, and very few live on glaciers. Moreover, very few people can really imagine what it would be to be like a polar bear on a glacier. And in fact, the one thing they know about polar bears and glaciers, no offense to people in this community, is that they're far away. They're really far away. And so the things, if the idea is I should drive a hybrid, you know, instead of a gas car to save that, I might do it if I'm empathetic, but it's not an immediate concern. And if the cost of driving the hybrid or the diesel is maybe more expensive, then, you know, maybe, so you can ask yourself a question, is this the best way to present things? Here's another, look at this. So here's a map of the world, and Europe is green. Isn't that great? It looks great, right? Because we want to be green. But there's two problems with this. First, let's see what this map is actually saying. This is the number of deaths attributed to climate change in the year 2000. Or deaths, you know, deaths aren't a great, this looks friendly and green, but it's a map of death, right? It doesn't convey that right away. But and you might think, okay, well, any number greater than 0 here is a bad thing. But if people aren't paying that much attention, and if they want to preserve their self-esteem, let's say you're a resident of Europe and you can say, oh, well, you know, we're green and at least we're not like Africa where, you know, their climate change is killing everyone. What I'm saying is this is not an image that conveys urgency, particularly if you live in one of the green areas, right? If you wanted to convey urgency, if you want to say people are dying because of climate change, this might not be the right image. Although I will say, it's correct from a scientific point of view, it's consistent with the data. So for an expert community, we can look at this and agree on what it means. But if you're trying to use an image like this to persuade the public, let me just suggest to you, it's not going to work. right? Because there's all kinds of ways to interpret this to say, oh, well, we're okay, at least we're not red, okay? Increasing the odds of winning the battle for elaboration depends on us making it local, right? Trying to convey images in ways that matter to the life experience of the people we're talking with, to make the consequences concrete and immediate. Climate science is very important, but if we're trying to get someone to replace an old light bulb with a new light bulb, maybe what we should talk about to someone is energy savings or pollution or something they can see, because it will be more persuasive. If we're talking with policymakers, maybe we need to talk about it from their perspective. Doesn't mean we need to do climate science differently. It means if we want to make climate science relevant to policy, we have to act differently, right? And we have to talk about making the desired outcome possible to achieve. The last thing I'll discuss is credibility. A lot of experts believe that because we're experts, people should believe us. Let me show you the problem with that. So I want to begin in talking about credibility by asking you, what is that? Okay? What it is that it's an image from the very first psychology dissertation written at Harvard University. It is a rabbit duck. Okay? To see that it's a duck, here's the back of the duck's head, and here's its bill. To see the rabbit, this is the rabbit's nose, and these are the rabbit's ears. What's unique about this picture is that it has multiple meanings. And usually we think pictures have very discrete meanings, unlike words. Here's a word, duck, that means both this animal and this action, like if somebody's throwing a ball at me, I duck. Words often have multiple meanings, pictures don't. Why does that matter for credibility? Because we have a problem with language, and the problem is language indeterminacy. Words have multiple meanings, okay? So if we combine the fact that politics involves conflict and we have language indeterminacy, what they produce is an incentive to manipulate meaning, to try and manipulate the meaning of words. This happens in politics all the time. So the question becomes, who should people believe? Right? The answer depends a lot on credibility. Who is seen as credible? I'm happy to answer questions about this in the Q&A, but let me tell you some basics about credibility. I'm going to skip this example. For contested issues, high credibility is a must. But the key thing is that credibility is domain-specific, and it is bestowed by an audience. My PhD doesn't make me credible, right? What makes me credible in front of an audience is that that audience sees something in me that makes them believe that I'm knowledgeable about the issue at hand, and that I have their interests at heart. The perception of knowledge, the perception of common interests. Lacking either of those, I'm not credible, regardless of how many PhDs or publications I have. I'm not saying this is something that you should feel bad about. I'm saying this is just what happens. And if you want to be persuasive, it's better to deal with that. There is an extensive literature on credibility, principally in the psychology discipline, that talk about credibility as a function of attributes of me, of what I say, attributes of you, attributes of the environment. The point being is credibility is bestowed by the audience. So the implications, the key thing is many of us overestimate our persuasive powers because we think that the biological limits of memory, of elaboration, and credibility don't apply to us. That because our intentions are so good and our knowledge are so deep, we get a free pass. We don't, okay? The second mistake we make is thinking that because audiences don't know what we know or won't listen to us, that they must be stupid. And they might be ignorant of some facts. But if you want to persuade an audience, the key thing to understand is they have reasons for what they're doing. They have reasons for what they know and what they don't know. And if your goal is to persuade them, you have to know those reasons. The analogy here is it's like trying to bring your friend out of the woods without knowing what they can do or where they are. Why would you think that could work? In persuasion, the rules are the same. What do they want? What can they do? If you understand that, you have a better chance of succeeding. So the final point I'll leave you with is information transmission is not the same as competence transmission. Conveying information is very easy. I put up a website, I make a flyer, I write a book. I can produce tens of thousands of copies, and I can tell myself that I succeeded because I made 10,000 copies or because my website had 100,000 hits. But are you conveying competence? Are you giving people new abilities? That requires knowing things about attention and memory that you can't necessarily find in web hit stats. Okay? Thank you very much, and I'll take questions now. Is that, yeah.
Thank you. Okay, thank you so much for this interesting presentation, and now let's take the advantage to ask them questions. Yeah, please.
I would like to ask my question in view of the issue we touched yesterday, the connection between science and democracy. And it turns out that the issue is rather a question of the relation between science and parliaments. In many cases, first one has to go to the parliaments and then consider the parliaments as the voters, as you say. Okay. Now, if you take your example of the friends in the wood, the issue is also, it depends on their state or the state of their mind in terms of, you could say, credibility. Either they, in function of the situation where they feel they are, they will be inclined to follow your advice or not to follow your advice. And we have in Switzerland, in our parliament, a group called Team Future, where all the different parties are represented, and we have interaction on semi-regular basis with them or regular basis with them. And recently one of these members told us, you should realize that in our parliament, at the most 30% of the members know how a university is organized and is running. And in the same frame, I know that the French Academy of Sciences have completely taken a completely different approach. And many of their members are in personal contacts, regular personal contacts with members of the parliament, independent of the issue of the case, you are in the forest or you are on the iceberg. And my question is, how do you feel that the importance of this long-term investment into, and not the case-to-case situation, but the long-term investment in view of, let's say, helping for the credibility of...
Okay, yes, thank you. Has anyone here ever served in a legislature in public office? Okay, I mean, so if you serve in a legislature, particularly if you get to a more powerful or higher level legislature, there are all manner of people trying to get your attention, right? All kinds of people saying that their issue is very important and more resources should be directed to them. And so a big challenge that parliamentarians face is who to trust. An investment in a long-term relationship can sometimes take trust out of the equation, because if you and I have known each other for a long time and we've helped each other and we've given each other advice and that advice has been valid, truthful, then when new issues come up, we don't have to build a relationship. For credibility, the two key components are perceived knowledge and perceived common interest, or a basis for trust. If one of those is absent, there's no credibility. So I think in answer to your question, for legislators, if you want to influence a legislature, long-term relationships are a good way to do it, because otherwise you're just one in the crowd of all these people who are trying to get attention. Does that answer your question? Yeah, I think you might think it would be better if legislators were more flexible in their minds and able to sort of take in new arguments. But if you put yourself in the place of a legislator, or really any public figure, think about all the people who are saying, oh, no, my idea is the best. It's probably all you hear. And so to stand out, right, you have to have something that differentiates you. A long-term basis for trust can be that.
Okay, I think we have a second question and then a third one.
Yes, so you, from what I understood from your presentation, you seem to argue in favor of fixing voters by providing them with data using basically the same techniques that commercial advertisement uses to convey information. But as you pointed out very clearly in your presentation, this method for conveying information requires that you appeal to the personal interest, to the very close interest of the person. You showed this map of death because of climate change, and that to make it have an effect on the voter, you need to make sure that they also see the effect it can have on them. But don't you think that, at least to some degree, democracy also requires that the voter can make a choice that actually saves these dying Africans, even if I am not dying right now? And more generally, don't you fear that by concentrating on these techniques to fixing the voter, you would actually reinforce this tendency of the voter to make selfish choices and remove even the ability for voters to make choices for the public good, if you want?
Thank you. That's a very good question. Let me distinguish two things. One is the method for persuasion, and the other is the cognitive basis where an audience starts. The methods that I'm talking about implies learning about what the voter wants. Now, the voter may want selfish things or not. That's not required, right? So if I am a religious person and I care primarily about, the sanctity of life, right? Then if you make an appeal to me about Africa on that basis, right, then it will be persuasive to me. So the point is, there's no distinction what I'm saying about selfish, not selfish. The point is, people have interests. Some of them are selfish, some of them recognize the world, some of them recognize collective goods. My point is, if you want to be persuasive, you need to know what this person values. If you assume what the person values and you get it wrong, you're going to waste a lot of time and effort trying to talk to them. Right? So if you were trying to persuade me to do more about climate change because of Africa, if Africa was going to be your prime example, you'd want to make sure that Africa was something I cared about. And if Africa was very important to me, then your presentation could be all Africa. But if I don't know much about Africa, if I can't relate to Africa and I don't care about it, and your presentation is all about Africa, I'm probably asleep. Even if I'm nodding at the right times, I'm probably not paying attention as soon as you start talking. Does that make sense? So this is not so much about selfish or not. It's about learning about the values of your audience if you want to be persuasive. Now, there's a whole other matter, which is, can we train people to be sensitive about the needs of others? Right? And that's something we can do. What I'll say about that is the techniques for doing that are not dissimilar from what I've talked about, right? I mean, I can't get you from being totally selfish to caring about Africa, but if I know that you care about children or young people or certain types of if you have certain types of cultural sensitivities, and I say, those things you care about, they're present in Africa. Africa was the birthplace of these things. Africa has more of this than any place you know, and so therefore, if you have a certain set of beliefs now, you should also care about Africa. That's the way I could try to.
Okay, then we had another question. Get focused.
Quick question to your definition of the voter's competence. Maybe that my short-term memory lost it or got distracted. So you said the voter is competent if he or she makes the same choice.
So this definition is problematic for a philosophical reason.
Okay, thank you. Then I got it.
Yeah, it's so the philosophical black hole right next to this definition is what is the optimal state of knowledge. And the reason that it's a black hole is because a lot of times in politics we're not just debating technical facts about how the world works, we're debating propositions about what should be. As was talked about yesterday, right, in several of the presentations, it's hard to claim universal acceptance of basic ethical or moral maxims. Right, and so now let's think about what would full information constitute in a debate on abortion, right? Some people in the debate claim the sanctity of life is the fundamental premise that overshadows all others. So when making an argument about abortion, keep that first and privilege those facts. Where other people who are pro-choice would say, no, ultimately this is about choice. Right? This is about the rights of a person to make a decision about their lives. And if you have that point of view, you can say, privilege these facts over all others. And so there will not be an agreement there about what the facts are. But what you can do in talking about, so in a lot of my work, I can talk about competence with respect to technical definitions. I can find sort of simpler questions and say, okay, this person makes the same decision they would have made had they known all the technical facts. But for moral questions, competence is something that people can argue about.
Okay, one last question.
Arthur, if I recall correctly or interpret correctly what you've said about binary choices, you seem to be implying that competent voters, competent majorities, are likely to make the right choices if presented with a binary election. However, in order to make that choice, somebody has had to frame the problem beforehand. In your presentation, you have focused on how to increase voters' competence to make the right choice. Would these principles apply then, or how would they differ for increasing competence to frame problems? Yeah. It is my belief that it is better to have an imperfect solution to a well-framed problem than a perfect solution to a problem that everybody understands differently. Thank you.
Yeah. So this is a very good question, and let me give it a slightly different answer, and then you can tell me if I'm answering your question. Because one of the questions I'm asked is, how do I feel about direct democracy, right? And voter competence in direct democracy. And the answer that I give, sometimes people blame voters for bad outcomes in direct democracy. And here's the analogy I use. Blaming voters for an outcome in direct democracy is like blaming us in the room for the lighting in this room. At most what we can do is turn the light switch on and off, but somebody else designed the whole lighting system, right? Somebody else basically framed the question, And so you can have a vote where I say, I voted for torture, and someone can say, how could you do that? I say, well, the alternative was worse, because there were only two choices. Right? I think one of the key, so I don't know if I'm answering your question, but one of the key things with direct democracy, if you wanted to achieve certain values, most of the attention you have to pay is on how the questions are written. Because the voters don't get to do very much. They get to say yes or no. And a chimp with a coin gets that right half the time.
Okay. So thanks a lot. I'd like to thank. It was really great. So thanks a lot.